What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected voices refuses to play along with a talk show host's disrespectful games? In just 34 seconds of uncomfortable silence, a television interview transforms from casual conversation into an explosive confrontation that nobody saw coming. It started like any other evening interview. The studio lights were bright, the cameras were rolling, and Morgan Freeman walked onto the set with his signature calm demeanor. He settled into the guest chair across from Piers Morgan, ready for what he assumed would be a standard promotional interview. The audience applauded as Freeman adjusted his microphone, offering a polite smile to the host. Piers Morgan leaned back in his chair with that familiar smirk, the one that suggested he already knew how the entire conversation would unfold. He shuffled his note cards and looked directly at his guest. "Morgan Freeman, welcome to the show," Piers said, his tone dripping with false enthusiasm. "It's not every day we get actual talent in this chair." Freeman nodded graciously. "Thank you for having me. Let's get right into it," Piers continued, barely acknowledging the response. "You've been in this industry for decades, and yet you're still taking roles that, quite frankly, seem beneath someone of your stature. Why is that?" The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the playful banter they expected. Freeman's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. "I choose projects that interest me," Freeman replied evenly. "Projects that challenge me as an actor and tell stories worth telling." Piers laughed, but it wasn't a warm laugh. It was dismissive. "Stories worth telling? You were in a film last year that barely made back its budget. Surely someone with your reputation could be more selective." Freeman leaned forward slightly. "With all due respect, box office numbers don't define the value of art." "Oh, here we go," Piers said, rolling, his eyes dramatically for the camera. The artistic integrity speech. "Look, let's be honest with each other and with these people watching at home. You're past your prime. These roles you're taking, they're not leading man material anymore. You're the wise mentor, the sage advisor, the voice of reason in the background. Don't you ever feel like you're just collecting a paycheck at this point?" The studio went silent. Someone in the audience gasped. Freeman's jaw tightened, but his voice remained controlled. "I think you're confusing selectivity with ageism," Freeman said carefully. "I'm fortunate to still be working in an industry that often discards actors once they reach a certain age. The roles I choose have depth and meaning." Piers waved his hand dismissively. "Meaning, sure. But let's talk about relevance. When was the last time you opened a film? Really carried it on your shoulders?" "I'm struggling to remember. That's not the metric by which I measure my career," Freeman responded. "Of course it isn't," Piers shot back, "because if it were, we'd have a very different conversation happening right now. Look, I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. You've had a great run, truly, but perhaps it's time to acknowledge that your moment is past." Freeman sat completely still. The camera zoomed in on his face, capturing the moment his patience began to wear thin. "My moment," Freeman repeated slowly. "You think my moment has passed?" "I don't think it. I know it," Piers said with absolute certainty. "The industry has moved on. Younger actors are taking the spotlight. Streaming services are changing everything. And frankly, audiences want something different now. They don't want to see the same faces they've been seeing for 40 years. "Is that so?" Freeman said. "It wasn't a question. It is so," Piers confirmed. "And I think deep down, you know it too. Otherwise, why would you be here? Why would you be doing the press circuit for these smaller films? You used to be too big for shows like this. Now you need us." The audience was dead silent. Even the crew members behind the cameras exchanged worried glances. This had crossed a line. Freeman took a slow breath. "I came here tonight as a courtesy. I was told this would be a respectful conversation about my work, and we're having that conversation," Piers interrupted. "I'm just being honest. Someone needs to be." "Honesty and cruelty are not the same thing," Freeman said quietly. "Oh, please," Piers scoffed. "Don't act wounded. You're a big boy. You can handle a little criticism. Or has it been so long since anyone challenged you that you've forgotten what real journalism looks like?" "Real journalism?" Freeman echoed. "Is that what you call this?" "Yes, actually," Piers said defensively. "I ask the questions that others are too afraid to ask. I don't softball. I don't kiss up to celebrities just because they've won some awards. That's what makes this show different." Freeman nodded slowly. "What makes this show different is that you confuse provocation with insight." Piers's face flushed red. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Freeman said, his voice still calm but carrying more weight now. You think being confrontational makes you a serious interviewer. It doesn't. It makes you a bully with a microphone. Now wait just a minute, Piers sputtered. I'm a bully? I'm trying to have an honest discussion here. No, Freeman corrected him. You're trying to humiliate a guest on your show to boost your own ego. There's a difference, the audience began to murmur. Some people were nodding in agreement. Piers looked around, clearly not expecting this reaction. I think you're being overly sensitive, Piers said, trying to regain control. All I did was point out some facts about your career trajectory. Facts, Freeman repeated. Let me share some facts with you. I've worked consistently for over 5 decades. I've been nominated for 5 Academy Awards and won one. I've narrated countless documentaries and lent my voice to projects that educate and inspire. I've played roles that challenge stereotypes and open doors for other actors. And I've done all of this while maintaining my dignity and treating people with respect. Can you say the same? Piers's mouth opened and closed. He looked down at his note cards as if they might save him. I've built a successful career, Piers finally said weakly. By tearing others down, Freeman added. By creating controversy where none needs to exist. By mistaking rudeness for bravery. This is my show, Piers said, his voice rising, and I won't be spoken to this way. Then perhaps you should reconsider how you speak to your guests, Freeman replied. Piers stood up from his chair, pointing at Freeman. You know what? Maybe this interview was a mistake. Maybe I was wrong to think you could handle a real conversation. Freeman remained seated, perfectly composed. A real conversation involves 2 people listening to each other. What you want is a punching bag, and I'm not interested in playing that role. Fine, Piers snapped. Then why don't you leave? If you're so offended by my questions, there's the door. The audience gasped again. This was unprecedented. Hosts didn't kick guests off their shows, especially not guests of Freeman's caliber. Freeman looked at Piers for a long moment. Then he looked at the audience, then back at Piers. You're asking me to leave? Freeman said quietly. I'm telling you that if you can't handle the format of this show, then yes, perhaps it's best if you go, Piers said, crossing his arms. Freeman slowly removed his microphone. He placed it carefully on the arm of his chair. The studio was so quiet, you could hear the microphone click against the leather. I've sat across from some of the greatest interviewers in the world, Freeman said, standing up. Charlie Rose, James Lipton, Barbara Walters. People who knew how to ask difficult questions without sacrificing their humanity. You could learn something from them. Get out, Piers said, his face now completely red. Get out of my studio. Freeman straightened his jacket. I was already leaving. As Freeman walked toward the exit, Piers called after him. You're finished. Do you hear me? After this stunt, no one will want to work with you. Freeman stopped. He turned back slowly, and for the first time all evening, he smiled. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who knew better. No one will want to work with me, Freeman said. I'll be fine. The question is, who will want to come on your show after this? The audience erupted. Some people stood up and started clapping. Others were filming on their phones. Piers looked around in confusion, clearly not understanding that the room had turned against him. Sit down, Piers shouted at the audience. This is still my show. Sit down. But Freeman was already gone. He walked through the studio doors without looking back, leaving Piers standing alone in front of a crowd that was no longer on his side. One of the producers rushed onto the set, trying to salvage the situation. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of Piers's meltdown. This is unbelievable, Piers said to the camera. Absolutely unbelievable. I invite a guest onto my show. I ask legitimate questions, and this is how I'm treated? This is the problem with celebrities today. They can't handle any criticism. They live in these bubbles where everyone tells them how wonderful they are, and the moment someone challenges them, they run away. A voice from the audience shouted, "You were rude to him." Piers spun around. "I was not rude. I was being a journalist." "You insulted him." Another voice called out. "I did not insult him," Piers insisted, but his voice was shaking now. "I asked tough questions. That's my job." The producer was whispering urgently in Piers's ear, probably telling him to wrap it up, but Piers pushed him away. "No," Piers said. "No, I'm not ending this segment until I say what needs to be said. Morgan Freeman walked off this set because he couldn't handle a real interview. That's the truth. And if that makes me the bad guy, then so be it." But as he said this, the audience continued to murmur disapprovingly. People were shaking their heads. Some had already gotten up to leave. The energy in the room had completely shifted. Backstage, Freeman was surrounded by staff members apologizing profusely. The segment producer was mortified, explaining that they had no idea Piers would take that approach. Freeman accepted their apologies with grace, even as he packed up his belongings. "It's not your fault," Freeman told them. "Some people just can't help themselves." Back in the studio, Piers was still trying to justify his behavior to an audience that had stopped listening. His voice grew louder and more defensive with each passing second. "You know what?" Piers said to the camera. "I'm glad he left. I'm glad. Because now everyone can see what happens when you refuse to play along with the Hollywood elite. They want compliments and softballs. They want interviewers who worship at their feet. Well, that's not me. That's never been me. And it never will be me." The audience was barely paying attention now. People were checking their phones, reading what was already being posted online about the confrontation. Within minutes, clips of the interview were circulating on social media, and the consensus was clear. Piers had crossed a line. One audience member raised her hand. Piers, desperate for any kind of engagement, pointed at her. "Yes, you have a question?" The woman stood up. "Why did you treat him like that? He's Morgan Freeman. He's a legend." "Legends aren't above criticism," Piers replied. "There's criticism and then there's disrespect," she said. "You were disrespectful." "I disagree," Piers said firmly. "Of course you do," she replied, sitting back down. Another person stood up without waiting to be called on. "You basically told him his career was over. How is that journalism?" "I was making an observation," Piers defended. "You were being mean," the person said simply. More people started speaking up, and suddenly Piers was facing a room full of critics. The very thing he had tried to do to Freeman was now being done to him. "Okay, that's enough," Piers said, waving his hands. "We're going to take a break. When we come back, I'll be joined by my next guest, who hopefully will be able to handle a grown-up conversation." The cameras cut, and Piers stormed off the set. The audience sat in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. In the green room, Freeman was preparing to leave the building. A young intern approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Freeman, I just want to say that I'm so sorry about what happened out there. That was completely unprofessional." Freeman smiled kindly at her. "Don't worry about it. I've dealt with worse." "Really?" she asked. "Really?" he confirmed. "Though, I'll admit, that was particularly unpleasant." "What he said about your career," she continued, "none of that is true. You're amazing. Everyone knows that." "Thank you," Freeman said. "That's very kind of you to say." As he walked toward the exit, other staff members stopped him to apologize or offer words of support. Freeman accepted each gesture graciously, never once speaking poorly of Piers or the show itself. He simply acknowledged that the interview hadn't gone as planned and moved on. Meanwhile, Piers was in his dressing room, pacing back and forth. His producer had followed him and was trying to explain the severity of the situation. "Piers, this is bad," the producer said. "It's already trending online. People are furious." "People are always furious," Piers dismissed. "They'll forget about it by tomorrow." "I don't think." "So?" the producer said nervously. "Not this time. You kicked Morgan Freeman off the show." "Morgan Freeman. Do you understand how that looks?" "It looks like I have standards," Piers insisted. "It looks like you bullied a beloved actor for no reason," the producer corrected him. Piers whirled around. "I did not bully him. I asked him questions." "Hard questions." "You told him his career was over," the producer said. "You said he was past his prime. You accused him of just collecting paychecks. How is that not bullying?" "It's called journalism," Piers repeated stubbornly. The producer rubbed his temples. "Piers, you need to do damage control. You need to apologize." "Apologize?" Piers laughed bitterly. "I will not apologize for doing my job." "Then you might not have a job much longer," the producer warned. Back in the studio, the show resumed with the next guest. But the energy was completely different now. The audience was distracted, still talking about what had happened. The guest seemed uncomfortable, clearly aware of the tension, and Piers, trying desperately to act like nothing was wrong, came across as even more aggressive than before. Every question sounded like an attack. Every comment felt loaded with hostility. The guest gave short, careful answers, clearly not wanting to become the next person humiliated on live television. The interview lasted barely 10 minutes before Piers wrapped it up, sensing that he was losing the room entirely. When the show finally ended, Piers sat alone on the set while the crew cleaned up around him. No one made eye contact. No one asked if he needed anything. The usual post-show chatter was absent. Everyone just wanted to leave. Piers pulled out his phone and saw the notifications flooding in, thousands of them. He opened social media and immediately wished he hadn't. The top trending topic was his name alongside Freeman's, and the comments were brutal. Piers Morgan's career is actually over after tonight. Imagine thinking you're more important than Morgan Freeman. That was the most uncomfortable interview I've ever watched. Piers Morgan needs to learn the difference between tough questions and cruel questions. Morgan Freeman showed more class in 30 seconds than Piers Morgan has shown in his entire career. On and on they went. Thousands of comments, almost all of them siding with Freeman. Clips of the interview had been watched millions of times already. Entertainment news sites were writing articles with headlines like "Morgan Freeman walks out on disastrous interview" and "Piers Morgan crosses the line." Piers tried to convince himself that it didn't matter. That controversy was good for ratings, that people would tune in next week just to see what he'd do next. But deep down, he knew this was different. This wasn't the kind of controversy that helped a career. This was the kind that ended them. He thought about calling Freeman to apologize. He picked up his phone, pulled up his manager's contact, ready to ask for Freeman's number. But then his pride kicked in. Why should he apologize? He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd ask questions. If Freeman couldn't handle that, that was Freeman's problem, not his. He put the phone down. The studio was empty now. The lights were being shut off one by one. Piers sat in the growing darkness, replaying the interview in his mind. He tried to pinpoint where it had gone wrong. Was it the comment about Freeman being past his prime? Was it the suggestion that he was just collecting paychecks? Was it the dismissive tone? Or was it everything? Was it the entire approach, the fundamental misunderstanding of what an interview should be? Piers shook his head. No, he refused to accept that. He was a good interviewer. He was a great interviewer. People were just too sensitive these days. They couldn't handle honesty anymore. But as he sat there alone, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered, "What if? They're right?" He pushed the thought away and stood up. He walked out of the studio with his head held high, refusing to acknowledge the doubt creeping in at the edges of his consciousness. Miles away, Morgan Freeman was at home, having already moved on from the evening's events. He'd dealt with difficult people before and would deal with them again. This was just another Tuesday in a long, distinguished career. His phone rang. It was his agent. "Have you seen the news?" the agent asked. "I've seen enough," Freeman replied calmly. "Everyone's on your side," the agent said. "Everyone. This is actually working out in your favor. I didn't do it for favorable publicity," Freeman said. "I did it because I wasn't going to sit there and be disrespected." "Well, either way, your phone is going to be ringing off the hook tomorrow. Every show in the country is going to want to interview you about this," Freeman sighed. "I think I'll pass." "Really?" The agent sounded surprised. "Really?" Freeman confirmed. "I'm not interested in making this a bigger story than it needs to be. What happened, happened. Now I'd like to move forward." "You're handling this with a lot of grace," the agent said. "I'm handling it the only way I know how," Freeman replied. They talked for a few more minutes before hanging up. Freeman turned off his phone and settled into his favorite chair. He picked up the book he'd been reading and opened to the page he'd marked. And just like that, the incident was behind him. Not forgotten, but filed away as just another experience in a life full of them. He didn't need to dwell on it. He didn't need revenge or vindication. He'd stood up for himself, maintained his dignity, and walked away. That was enough. The next morning, the story was everywhere. News outlets, entertainment shows, podcasts, blogs. Everyone had an opinion. Most of those opinions were critical of Piers and supportive of Freeman. Piers woke up to find his inbox flooded, with messages from colleagues, friends, and even family members telling him he'd gone too far. His social media mentions were a nightmare. His producer called early to schedule an emergency meeting, but Piers still refused to apologize. In his mind, apologizing would be admitting defeat. It would be validating everyone who said he was wrong, and he couldn't do that. His entire brand was built on being unapologetic, on being the person willing to say what others wouldn't. If he backed down now, what would that say about him? So instead, he doubled down. He posted a statement on social media defending his interview style and suggesting that Freeman had overreacted. The statement only made things worse. Now, he wasn't just the host who'd been rude to a beloved actor. He was the host who'd been rude and refused to acknowledge it. The backlash intensified. Sponsors started pulling out. Other celebrities announced they would decline future invitations to appear on the show. The network, Executives called an emergency meeting to discuss the situation, and through it all, Morgan Freeman remained silent. He didn't give interviews about the incident. He didn't post on social media. He simply continued with his life and his work, letting his actions from that night speak for themselves. Because sometimes, the most powerful response is no response at all. Sometimes, walking away with dignity is the strongest statement you can make. And sometimes, the person who stays calm and collected in the face of hostility is the person who wins in the end. That night in the studio, in front of cameras and a live audience, two very different approaches to conflict were on display. One person chose aggression, provocation, and ego. The other chose restraint, self-respect, and quiet strength. And when the dust settled, it became clear which approach had more lasting value. Not because of what happened after, not because of the fallout or the consequences, but because of what happened in those moments themselves, the way each person carried themselves, the words they chose, the dignity they maintained or failed to maintain. Morgan Freeman didn't need to destroy Piers Morgan. He didn't need to humiliate him or seek revenge. All he needed to do was refuse to participate in his own disrespect. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching what real strength looks like. It doesn't shout, it doesn't threaten, it doesn't need to prove itself. It simply stands up, removes the microphone, and walks away, leaving behind only the echo of words that can never be taken back and a lesson that will never be forgotten. What happened when one of Hollywood's most respected voices refused to play along with a talk show host's disrespectful games? The answer is simple. He showed the world that some people are exactly who you think they are, and some people are exactly who they've always claimed they weren't. The cameras captured it all. The words were recorded. The moment was preserved. And years from now, when people look back on this interview, they won't remember the specific questions or the precise insults. They'll remember how one person treated another. They'll remember who kept their composure and who lost it. They'll remember who walked away and who was left standing alone. That's the real story. Not what was said, but how it was said. Not what happened next, but what happened then. In that studio, under those lights, in front of those cameras, two people revealed exactly who they were. And only one of them should be proud of what was revealed.